Princess Velara of the Althean Dominion, sat upon her crystalline throne and watched another suitor fall to his knees before her. And she felt nothing but the familiar weight of boredom pressing against her mind like a stone sinking through water. This one was a Kellis diplomat with 4 arms and skin that shifted colors with his emotions. And right now, he glowed a desperate shade of violet as he launched into his rehearsed speech about eternal devotion and the stars, themselves bending to witness their union. She had heard it all before 847 times before, to be exact. The number sat in her memory like a monument to disappointment, and each suitor had added their own brick to that tower of failed attempts to win her heart. The Kellis finished his speech with a flourish of all 4 arms, and the court held its breath in anticipation. And Velara simply raised one slender hand in the gesture that had become famous across 12 star systems. "You may leave," she said, her voice carrying no malice but also no warmth. And the diplomat's skin faded to a defeated gray as he backed away from the throne. High Counselor Morthax stood at the edge of the throne room with his arms crossed and his ancient face twisted into an expression of frustration that he no longer bothered to hide. For he had served the royal family for 3 centuries and had never encountered a problem quite like the princess. The Althean species had evolved on a world where communication meant survival, and their neural networks could process language at speeds that made other species seem like they were speaking through thick mud. And every conversation between Altheans contained layers upon layers of meaning that lesser beings could never hope to understand. To the Altheans, words were everything. They were art and science and warfare and love all wrapped into the beautiful complexity of speech. Silence was considered a curse among their people, an emptiness that spoke of death and the cold void between stars where nothing lived and nothing mattered. And yet here sat their princess, rejecting every eloquent suitor who came before her, as if the finest words in the galaxy meant nothing to her at all. Emperor Kelthos watched from his private balcony above the throne room as another suitor departed in shame, and he turned to his chief advisor with worry carved deep into the lines of his silver face. "How many more can we afford to offend before our allies begin to question our sincerity in seeking a match for my daughter?" he asked, and his voice carried the exhaustion of a father who had tried everything and failed. The advisor consulted her data tablet and shook her head slowly, for the numbers were not encouraging. "We have received formal complaints from 17 noble houses across 9 systems, Your Majesty. And the Vorthian Empire has suggested that our princess may be deliberately insulting their prince by rejecting him so quickly after his journey of 200 light years." The emperor closed his eyes and breathed deeply, trying to find the patience that had once come so easily to him. War was coming. Everyone could feel it brewing on the galactic rim where the darkness, collective, had been massing forces for decades. And the Althean Dominion needed allies desperately. And the traditional way to forge such alliances had always been through marriage. But his daughter seemed determined to reject every possible candidate, and he could not force her into a match she did not want, for such was not the Althean way. He descended the hidden stairs and emerged into the throne room, just as Velara was rising from her seat, and she turned to face him with those silver eyes that reminded him so painfully of her mother. "Father," she said, and her voice softened slightly as it always did when they spoke in private. "I know what you are going to say. Then perhaps you can save me the trouble and explain why you continue to reject every suitor who presents themselves to you," he replied, walking slowly toward her with his hands clasped behind his back. Velara looked away, her gaze drifting to the vast windows that showed the purple sky of Althea Prime and the twin moons rising in the distance. "They all speak so beautifully," she said, and there was something strange in her voice, something almost like longing mixed with disappointment. "And their words are crafted with such precision and care. And they promise me everything the universe has to offer. Is that not what you desire?" Her father asked, genuinely confused by her answer. That is exactly the problem. Father, they speak and speak and speak. And their words are perfect and empty and meaningless. And I can hear the calculations behind every syllable. And I can feel them measuring their performance against my reactions. And I know that they do not see me at all. She turned back to face him, and for a moment the emperor saw not a princess, but a young woman who was deeply tired of being treated like a prize to be won rather than a person to be known. They see a throne and an alliance and power and prestige, but when they look at me, they do not truly see me, and I am so very tired of being invisible inside my own life. The emperor had no answer for this, for he understood the loneliness of royalty better than anyone, and he reached out to take his daughter's hand in a rare gesture of paternal affection. What if we open the trials to other species? He suggested quietly, and Valara looked at him with surprise, for such a thing had never been done before. Other species cannot match our verbal capabilities, she reminded him, and they would be humiliated in the traditional trials. Perhaps humiliation is not the point, her father replied, thinking of the desperate times ahead and the need for unexpected alliances. And perhaps it is time we looked beyond our own narrow definitions of worth. The announcement went out across the galactic networks the very next day, and it caused quite a stir among the civilized worlds. The Althean Dominion was opening its suitor trials to all spacefaring species, including the newly contacted humans who had only recently ventured beyond their own solar system. Most of the galaxy laughed at the idea of primitive humans attempting to compete in Althean verbal trials, for the humans were known to be slow-tongued and simple in their communication, lacking the neural sophistication that other species took for granted. But desperation made for strange decisions, and the Emperor hoped that somewhere in the vast cosmos there existed anyone who could finally reach his daughter's heart. Valara received the news with a mixture of curiosity and resignation, for she doubted that opening the trials to lesser species would change anything at all. But she agreed to her father's plan because she loved him and because she had run out of reasons to say no. Little did she know that across the galaxy, aboard a small human diplomatic vessel preparing for its first mission to Althea Prime, stood a man who had not spoken a voluntary word in 6 years, a man whose silence would prove more eloquent than all the words in the universe. But that meeting was still many days away, and for now, Princess Valara simply returned to her throne and waited for the next wave of suitors to arrive, hoping against hope that this time would somehow be different. The stars continued their ancient dance above Althea Prime, indifferent to the struggles of those who lived beneath their light and somewhere in the depths of space. Destiny was already setting its course toward an encounter that would change everything. The human diplomatic vessel, Aurora, descended through the purple clouds of Althea Prime, and Ambassador Sarah Chun pressed her face against the viewport like a child seeing snow for the first time. Everything about this world seemed designed to overwhelm the senses. The sky shifted between shades of violet and deep crimson. The buildings rose in spiraling towers of living crystal that sang softly in the wind, and the air itself carried a faint shimmer that made reality feel slightly dreamlike. "Commander Cole, come look at this," she called over her shoulder. But the man standing at the back of the observation deck did not move from his position. Marcus Cole was 34 years old, with dark hair cut military short and eyes the color of deep space. And he stood with the perfect stillness of a statue carved from stone, watching without reacting, present without participating. Ambassador Chun had learned not to expect verbal responses from him during the 3-week journey to Althea Prime, for Commander Cole had not spoken a voluntary word in 6 years. The other members of the security detail had whispered about him during the voyage, sharing the stories they had heard about the legendary soldier who had held Europa Station together through 18 days of absolute silence. The enemy forces had possessed neural scanning technology that detected sound and movement, and the only way to keep 400 colonists alive had been to exist in complete and total quiet, no crying, no talking, no sounds of any kind for nearly 3 weeks. Something had broken inside Marcus during those endless silent days. Or perhaps something had been rebuilt in a different shape. And when the rescue ships finally arrived, they found a man who had forgotten how to fill the world with unnecessary noise. He communicated through gestures now, through written notes on his datapad, and most of all, through the remarkable expressiveness of his dark eyes that his fellow soldiers had learned to read like a sacred text. The Aurora landed on a platform of polished amethyst, and the human delegation assembled at the exit ramp with Ambassador Chun at the front, and the security detail arranged in formation behind her. Marcus took his position at the edge of the group, his role simple and clear. He was there to protect, not to participate in diplomatic matters that required the use of words he could not provide. Althean officials greeted them with flowing speeches of welcome that went on for nearly an hour, and Marcus stood motionless through all of it, his eyes taking in every detail of his surroundings, while his mind mapped exits and potential threats. The other humans shifted their weight and struggled to maintain attentive expressions as the speeches continued, but Marcus remained as still as the crystal spires around them. And several Altheans noticed this strange human who seemed completely comfortable in extended silence. They were escorted to guest quarters in a tower that overlooked the capital city, and Ambassador Chun called a meeting to prepare for the next day's events. The Suitor trials begin tomorrow, she explained to her team, spreading holographic documents across the table. And we are here primarily to observe and establish diplomatic relations. Our invitation to participate was largely ceremonial, and no one expects humans to actually compete. She glanced at Marcus, who stood near the window with his back to the room, watching the alien sunset paint the sky in colors that had no names in human languages. Our goal is simple: make a good impression, show that humanity is ready to be taken seriously on the galactic stage, and maybe secure a trade agreement or two before we leave. The team discussed the strategy and protocols late into the night, and Marcus listened without contributing, filing away information that might prove useful if things went wrong, for things always went wrong eventually. The next morning, the human delegation entered the throne hall of whispers, and even Marcus felt a flicker of awe at the sheer scale and beauty of the space before them. The hall was carved from a single massive crystal that amplified every sound into complex harmonies, and the acoustics transformed even simple words into music that resonated in the bones. Hundreds of Altheans filled the viewing galleries, their silver eyes fixed on the procession of suitors who would present themselves to Princess Valara today. Marcus had read the briefing documents about the princess, her centuries of life, her legendary standards, her 847 rejected suitors, and he expected to see someone proud and cold and impossibly distant. But when his eyes found her on the crystalline throne, he saw something different. He saw exhaustion hidden behind perfect posture, loneliness disguised as dignity, and a desperate hunger for something genuine buried beneath layers of royal composure. He recognized that look because he had seen it in his own mirror for 6 long years. The first suitor approached the throne, a Vorthian noble with muscles that rippled beneath, blue-gray skin, and a voice that boomed through the hall with practiced confidence. He spoke of his military conquests and his vast wealth and the glory he would bring to any union. And his words echoed through the crystal chamber like thunder. And Princess Valara watched him with eyes that had already moved on to somewhere else. She rejected him with a small gesture before he even finished his speech. The second suitor was more subtle, a Kellis poet who wove telepathic images through his spoken words, creating a tapestry of promised devotion that made several Altheans in the audience weep with its beauty. Valara thanked him politely and sent him away. 7 more suitors presented themselves throughout the morning, each more impressive than the last. each demonstrating mastery of language and persuasion that left the human delegation feeling hopelessly outclassed. Ambassador Chun leaned toward her aide and whispered, "We should not have come. There is nothing we can offer that can compete with this." But something strange was happening on the throne. Princess Velara had been gazing absently across the hall, her mind clearly wandering to somewhere far from this endless parade of performances, when her silver eyes suddenly stopped and focused with sharp intensity. She was staring at the human delegation. No, she was staring at the silent figure standing motionless at the edge of their group. She was staring at Marcus Cole. He felt her gaze like a physical touch, and he met her eyes without flinching, without performing, without trying to be anything other than exactly what he was. For a long moment, princess and soldier simply looked at each other across the crowded hall, and something passed between them that neither could name. She felt nothing from him, no desperate energy trying to impress her, no calculated performance designed to win her favor, no noise at all. Just stillness, vast and calm, like the peaceful darkness between stars where the universe took a breath. For the first time in 800 years, Princess Velara encountered true quiet, and she discovered that she could not look away. Her father noticed her sudden attention and followed her gaze to the unremarkable human standing apart from his delegation, and confusion creased his ancient face. "That one," Velara said suddenly, and her voice cut through the murmur of the court like a blade through silk. "I wish to know his name." Ambassador Chun nearly choked on her own surprise, and the entire hall fell into shocked silence as every eye turned toward the human security officer, who had done nothing but stand still. "Your Highness," the ambassador managed to say, "that is Commander Marcus Cole of the Earth Defense Force. He is not here as a suitor, merely as part of my security detail." "Then perhaps," Princess Velara replied, and for the first time in decades, there was something like genuine interest warming her voice. "He should become one." The hall erupted into chaos. The news of Princess Velara's request spread across the galaxy like wildfire through dry grass, and within hours every major news network was broadcasting the same impossible headline. The princess, who had rejected over 800 suitors, had personally requested that a silent human soldier be added to the trials. Ambassador Chun paced the floor of the human delegation's quarters with her hands pressed against her temples, trying to process what had just happened. "Commander Cole cannot participate in verbal trials," she said for perhaps the 20th time. "He does not speak. How can he compete in competitions designed entirely around the mastery of language?" Marcus sat in a chair by the window, his face calm and unreadable, and he simply shrugged his shoulders in response. The gesture said more than most people's paragraphs. It said that he did not ask for this, did not expect this, but was willing to face whatever came next, because that was simply what he did. A message arrived from the palace within the hour, bearing the royal seal of the Alphean Dominion. "The princess has declared that the human soldier will compete according to his own nature," Ambassador Chun read aloud, her voice thick with disbelief, "and that the trials will be adapted to allow for alternative forms of expression." The other suitors were furious. Lord Vorthax of the Vorthian Empire demanded an audience with the emperor to protest this obvious mockery of ancient traditions. And 3 noble houses threatened to withdraw their candidates entirely if a primitive human was allowed to stand among them. But Princess Velara would not be moved, and her father, desperate and curious, and perhaps secretly hoping that this strange development might finally reach his daughter, allowed the unprecedented arrangement to proceed. The first trial was called the Dance of Words, and it required each suitor to deliver a speech that would move the court to tears or laughter or inspiration. Marcus stood among the other competitors in the great hall, watching as one by one they took the center stage and filled the crystal chamber with magnificent orations. The Kellis delegate performed a speech about the nature of love that made several elderly Alpheans weep openly. And the Vorthian prince roared about honor and glory until the walls themselves seemed to shake with the force of his words. When Marcus's turn came, he walked slowly to the center of the hall with every eye upon him, and the silence that fell was so complete that it seemed to have physical weight. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the assembled crowd, and then he did something that no suitor had ever done before. He turned away from the audience and walked to the great windows that overlooked the city, and he pointed at Alphea's twin moons rising in the purple sky. One moon was covered in ancient impact craters, scarred by countless collisions over millions of years, while the other remained smooth and pristine. Marcus looked back at Princess Valara, and in his dark eyes she saw a question that needed no words. Which moon had survived more? The scarred one, obviously, and it endured blow after blow and kept shining, while the pristine moon had simply been lucky enough to avoid the trials that built true strength. The court murmured in confusion, but Valara understood, and something in her chest tightened with an emotion she had almost forgotten how to feel. The second trial was called the Weaving of Promises, and each suitor was required to describe the life they would build with the princess. Again, the competitors delivered elaborate visions of palaces and power and endless luxury, painting pictures of futures so perfect they seemed designed in laboratories. When Marcus took his turn, he did not go to the center stage. Instead, he noticed a young Althean servant girl who had collapsed against a pillar, exhausted from the long hours of service and trying desperately not to draw attention to herself. He walked to her slowly, knelt beside her, and offered her his own water container with a gentle gesture. She looked up at him with surprise and fear, clearly expecting punishment for showing weakness in the royal hall. But Marcus simply waited with patient kindness until she accepted the drink. He asked nothing in return, no gratitude, no recognition, no acknowledgement from the crowd. He simply helped because she needed help, and that was enough. Princess Valara watched from her throne, and she felt tears building behind her eyes for the first time in centuries, because she finally understood what made this human different from every other suitor who had ever knelt before her. They all spoke about compassion and kindness and devotion, crafting beautiful words about the virtues they claimed to possess. But this silent man showed it, without performance, without calculation, without any expectation of reward. The other suitors noticed the princess's attention and grew increasingly desperate in their attempts to outshine the human who was beating them without saying a single word. Lord Vorthax confronted Marcus in the corridor after the second trial, his massive form blocking the hallway as his blue-gray skin flushed with rage. "You mock our traditions with your silence," he snarled, leaning down until his face was inches from the humans. "You offer nothing, no words, no pledges, no proof of worth, and yet the princess watches you like you are the only person in the room." Marcus met the alien's furious gaze without flinching, without backing away, without any sign of fear or aggression. He simply waited, still and calm, like a deep lake that remained undisturbed no matter what storms raged above it. Vorthax found himself increasingly unnerved by this complete lack of reaction, for he was accustomed to opponents who shouted back or cowered in submission. This quiet presence offered neither, and he did not know how to respond. "You will fail," he finally growled, stepping aside to let the human pass. "And when you do, the princess will see you for the empty nothing that you are." Marcus walked away without looking back, and somehow that simple departure felt more like victory than defeat. The days passed, and with each trial, Marcus found new ways to communicate without words. When asked to demonstrate wisdom, he sat with the elderly scholars in the palace library and listened to their stories with such genuine attention that they later told the princess. He was the first person in decades who had truly heard them. When asked to show courage, he stood between a frightened child and an aggressive palace guard who was enforcing curfew too harshly. and he did not move until the guard backed down. When asked to prove patience, he spent an entire day in the palace gardens, motionless as the statues around him, simply watching the alien flowers bloom and close as Althea's suns crossed the sky. The court began to whisper that perhaps words were not the only measure of a person's worth. Princess Valara found herself seeking out the silent human between trials, drawn to his presence like a ship to harbor. She did not understand why his quiet company felt more meaningful than all the eloquent conversations she had endured over her long life. But she knew that something was changing inside her, something was waking up that she had thought dead for centuries. "Why do you not speak?" she asked him one evening, as they stood together on a balcony watching the moon's rise. Marcus considered the question for a long moment, then took out his datapad and typed a response. "Words became weapons during the war," his message read. "And I learned that silence could be a shield. Now I find that I have forgotten how to put down the shield. But standing here with you, I think perhaps I am beginning to remember." Valara read his words and felt her heart crack open like an egg releasing something new and fragile into the light. "Everyone wants something from me," she whispered. "They all perform and calculate and measure their words against my reactions. But you just exist, quietly, honestly, and you let me do the same." Marcus looked at her, and in his dark eyes she saw understanding that needed no translation. For the first time in her very long life, Princess Valara felt truly seen. The storm broke on the 7th day of the trials, when High Counselor Morthax stood before the assembled court and declared that the human's continued presence was an insult to 3,000 years of Alphean tradition. "This creature offers nothing but silence," he thundered, his ancient voice filling the hall of whispers with righteous fury. "While our greatest nobles pour their hearts into words that would make the stars themselves weep with beauty, and yet our princess pays attention only to this empty vessel." The noble houses roared their agreement, and Lord Vorthax stepped forward with a grim smile on his brutal face. "I invoke the trial of truth," he declared, and gasps echoed through the crystal chamber. "Let this human prove his worth in the ancient way through combat, and we shall see if his precious silence can protect him when words give way to blades." The trial of truth was an old rite, rarely invoked in modern times, where suitors settled disputes through single combat in the arena of echoes, space designed to amplify every sound 1,000-fold. It was a test of body and spirit, but more importantly, it was a test of voice. For Althean warriors, traditionally fought with war cries and battle hymns that disrupted enemy concentration and demonstrated the power of their will. A silent human in such an arena would be at a devastating disadvantage. Emperor Kelthus rose from his throne with concern etched deep into his features. "Lord Vorthax, this challenge seems unfair given the humans' condition," he said carefully. "Perhaps we should—" "I accept." Every head in the hall turned toward the source of those words, and Ambassador Chun felt her heart stop in her chest. It was not Marcus who had spoken. The words had come from his datapad, held up so that its synthesized voice could be heard throughout the chamber. Marcus stood calm and ready, his dark eyes fixed on the Vorthian prince with an expression that held no fear, no anger, and no doubt. The arena was prepared within hours, and by nightfall the entire planet seemed to have gathered to witness the unprecedented match between an Alphean-allied prince and a silent human soldier. Princess Valara sat in the royal viewing box with her hands clenched tight in her lap, her silver eyes locked on Marcus as he walked onto the arena floor. She had tried to stop this, had argued with her father and the council for hours. But the ancient laws were clear. Once the trial of truth was invoked and accepted, it could not be refused without permanent disgrace. The arena of echoes was a vast circular space, lined with crystalline walls that caught and amplified every sound, turning whispers into thunder and footsteps into earthquakes. Lord Vorthax entered from the opposite side, his massive form gleaming with ceremonial armor that did little to hide the raw power of his muscles. He carried a traditional Vorthian warblade, curved and deadly, and his face wore the confident smile of a predator about to claim easy prey. "Little human," he called out, and his voice boomed through the arena like rolling thunder. "Your silence ends tonight one way or another." Marcus stood perfectly still in the center of the arena, dressed in simple combat gear with a standard Earth Defense Force blade in his hand. He made no response to the taunt, offered no battle cry of his own, simply waited with the patience of a man who had survived 18 days of silence against enemies far more dangerous than an arrogant prince. The signal was given, and Vorthax charged with a roar that shook the crystal walls. His war cry was designed to disorient and overwhelm, a technique perfected over generations of Vorthian warfare, and lesser opponents would have flinched or hesitated in the face of such sonic assault. Marcus did neither. He moved like water flowing around stone, sidestepping the charging prince with an economy of motion that seemed almost lazy in its efficiency. Vorthax spun and attacked again, his blade whistling through the air as his battle hymn rose in pitch and intensity, filling the arena with noise designed to confuse and disorient. But Marcus had spent 18 days learning to exist in silence, learning to filter out everything except what truly mattered, and the prince's shouting was just another kind of noise to be ignored. He fought like a ghost. Every movement was precise and minimal, every strike delivered without the grunts or shouts that warriors used to express exertion. His breathing remained slow and controlled, inaudible even in the acoustically enhanced arena. Vorthax grew increasingly frantic as he realized that his greatest weapon, the psychological warfare of sound, was completely useless against this strange human. He could not gauge his opponent's condition because there were no heavy breaths to indicate exhaustion. He could not predict attacks because there were no war cries to telegraph intentions. He could not break his enemy's concentration because there was no concentration to break only that terrible, peaceful stillness that seemed to absorb everything he threw at it. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the match continued, and even the most vocal supporters of Lord Vorthax grew quiet as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The Vorthian prince, champion of a dozen arena battles, was being systematically dismantled by a human who never made a sound. 20 minutes into the fight, Vorthax was bleeding from cuts on his arms and legs, his movements growing desperate and sloppy as frustration overwhelmed his training. Marcus remained unmarked, unhurried, his dark eyes tracking every movement with the patience of someone who had all the time in the universe. The end came suddenly. Vorthax overextended on a wild swing, putting all his remaining strength into one massive blow that was meant to end the fight, and Marcus simply was not there. He flowed around the attack like smoke, and when the Vorthian stumbled from his own momentum, the human's blade was at his throat in an instant. Absolute silence filled the arena. For what felt like an eternity, the two fighters remained frozen, the massive prince on his knees with the blade pressed against his pulse, and the silent human standing over him like a statue of some ancient war god. Then, Marcus did something that shocked the crowd even more than his victory. He spoke. One word, barely a whisper, but in the acoustics of the arena of echoes, it rang out like a bell tolling at midnight. He was not looking at Vorthax when he said it. His dark eyes were fixed on the royal viewing box, on the silver-eyed princess who had risen to her feet without realizing it. "You," he said, and his voice was rough from years of disuse, but somehow that made it more powerful, more real, more honest. It was not a demand or a plea or a declaration of love. It was simply a recognition of her, of this moment, of the connection that had grown between them through all those days of shared silence. Princess Valara felt her heart, which Althean physicians had long ago declared emotionally dormant. begin to race with an intensity she had never experienced. "You," she whispered back, though only those closest to her could hear. Marcus lowered his blade and stepped back from the defeated prince, and Vorthax scrambled to his feet with his face twisted between rage and confusion. "This proves nothing," he snarled. "One word does not make a—" "It proves everything," Princess Valara interrupted, her voice cutting through the arena with royal authority. "It proves that he can speak, but chooses not to. It proves that when he finally breaks his silence, it is not for politics or performance or personal gain. It proves that among all the suitors who have filled my ears with endless words, only this man has given me something truly precious." She stood tall in her viewing box, and the entire arena seemed to hold its breath. "He gave me the gift of quiet," she said, "and tonight he gave me his voice, and I cannot imagine a greater proof of worth than that." The crowd erupted into chaos, some cheering and some protesting, but Marcus heard none of it. He was looking at Valara, and she was looking at him, and in that shared gaze was a promise that needed no words at all. The final day of the suitor trials dawned with tension hanging over the palace like a storm cloud waiting to break. 17 candidates remained after the weeks of competition, each representing powerful factions and ancient alliances that could shape the future of the entire galaxy. Ambassadors and nobles had traveled from distant star systems to witness the princess's choice, and the Hall of Whispers was packed to capacity with beings who understood that history was about to be made. Emperor Kelthus sat upon his throne with his daughter beside him, and he studied her face for any hint of what decision lay behind those silver eyes. She had changed in the past weeks. He could see it in the way she carried herself, in the small smile that sometimes appeared when she thought no one was watching, in the life that had returned to features he had thought frozen forever. "The time has come," he announced, and his voice echoed through the crystal hall with ancient authority. "My daughter will now declare her choice, and the Althean Dominion will welcome a new member to our royal house." Princess Valara rose from her throne, and every eye in the hall fixed upon her with desperate intensity. The 17 remaining suitors stood in a row before her, each dressed in their finest ceremonial attire, each struggling to appear calm despite the nervous energy radiating from their bodies. At the far end of the row, slightly apart from the others, stood Marcus Cole in his simple Earth Defense Force uniform. He had been offered elaborate Althean clothing for the occasion, but he had declined with a shake of his head. And Valara had understood he would not pretend to be something he was not, even on this most important day. "I have spent my life drowning in words," she began, and her voice carried clearly through the perfect acoustics of the hall, "for 800 years. I have listened to the most eloquent beings in the galaxy tell me what they would give, what they would do, what they would become." She descended the crystalline steps slowly, her gown trailing behind her like captured starlight. They spoke of themselves, their glory, their achievements, their worth, and they expected me to be impressed by the precision of their promises and the beauty of their phrases. She paused, looking down the row of suitors who hung on her every word. "Lord Vorthax offered me an empire built on conquest and strength, and his words painted pictures of power that would have made my ancestors weep with envy." The Vorthian prince straightened with hope, but Valara's eyes had already moved on. "Ambassador Kellis offered me poetry that reached directly into my mind and showed me visions of devotion so perfect that several members of this court were moved to tears." The Kellis delegate's skin flushed with optimistic colors, but the princess continued walking. "Each of you has offered me something magnificent, words crafted with centuries of skill. Promises designed to appeal to every desire a princess might have. Performances that demonstrated the very height of what language can achieve." She stopped in front of Marcus, looking up into his dark eyes with an expression that made the entire hall hold its breath. "And then there is this human who has spoken one word to me in all the weeks he has been here. one single word, spoken not to impress me or win me or claim me, but simply to acknowledge that I exist. She turned to face the court, her voice rising with conviction. "Do you understand what that means?" she asked, and the question seemed directed at everyone and no one at once. Every other suitor saw the throne first and me second. They calculated what they could gain from this union and crafted their words accordingly. But this man, this silent soldier from a distant world, he simply saw him. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and High Counselor Morthax rose with protest already forming on his lips. "Your Highness, the traditions of our people have given me 800 years of loneliness," Valara interrupted, and her voice cracked with emotion she no longer tried to hide. "They have surrounded me with beautiful words that meant nothing and promised everything, and I am tired of being performed at." She reached out and took Marcus's hand in hers, and the simple gesture sent shockwaves through the assembled nobility. This human does not perform, he simply exists, fully present, honestly himself, without calculation or pretense, and in his presence, I have learned something I thought impossible. Her silver eyes glistened with tears that she did not try to stop. "I have learned that I matter more than my crown, that my peace matters more than politics, that being truly seen matters more than being praised, and that is a gift more precious than all the words in all the languages of all the species in this galaxy." Marcus squeezed her hand gently, and in that small pressure was all the tenderness that words could never adequately express. "I choose the silent one," Princess Valara declared, and her voice rang through the hall of whispers with the weight of destiny. "I choose the human." For a moment, absolute silence filled the chamber fitting, perhaps for an announcement that would reshape the galaxy. Then the chaos erupted. Some nobles stormed out in protest, their angry voices echoing through the crystal corridors as they declared this choice an insult to civilization itself. Others stood in stunned wonder, struggling to process what they had just witnessed. But Emperor Kalthos remained on his throne, watching his daughter with tears streaming down his ancient face, not tears of disappointment, but tears of joy at seeing her finally, truly happy. Ambassador Chun stepped forward with diplomatic reflexes that had been honed over decades of service. "Your Majesty," she addressed the Emperor with a bow, "Earth would be honored to formalize this union as an alliance between our peoples. The humans may be new to the galactic community, but we value loyalty and honor above all things. And Commander Cole represents the best of what we are." The Emperor nodded slowly, and his voice was thick with emotion when he spoke. "The Althean Dominion accepts the princess's choice, and we welcome humanity as our allies and partners in the challenges ahead." The formal ceremonies that followed lasted for hours, but Marcus and Valara barely noticed. They stood together through the speeches and declarations, through the signing of treaties and the exchange of diplomatic gifts, through the endless parade of congratulations and political maneuvering. And through it all, they held hands, anchored to each other in a sea of noise that no longer mattered. Later that night, when the celebrations had finally ended and the palace had grown quiet, they walked together to the balcony where they had first truly spoken. The twin moons hung above Althea Prime 1 scarred, one smooth, and Marcus pointed at the battered moon just as he had done during the trials. Valara smiled, understanding the question and finally offering her answer. "I used to think I was the smooth moon," she said softly, "protected and pristine, unmarked by the hardships that shaped everyone else. But I was wrong." She turned to face him, and in the moonlight, her silver eyes shone with hard-won wisdom. "I was the scarred one all along, hiding my damage behind a mask of perfection, and you saw through it. You recognize me, because you carry your own scars in the same way." Marcus raised his hand to her face, his touch gentle and warm, and for the first time in 6 years he wanted to speak, not because words were necessary, but because she deserved to hear his voice. "I found you," he whispered, and his rough voice cracked with emotion. In all this noise and performance and chaos, I found someone who understands the value of quiet, and I am not letting go. Velara laughed a real laugh, bright and surprised and full of joy she had forgotten she could feel. Then we faced the future together, she said. The silent soldier and the princess who was tired of words. What a strange pair we make. Marcus smiled, and his smile was better than any speech because it asked for nothing and promised everything. Historians would later call their union the Quiet Revolution, the moment that proved words were not the only measure of worth. That humanity's greatest strength was not technology or warfare, but something far more powerful. Presence, authenticity, the courage to simply be without performance or pretense. In a galaxy that had drowned itself in noise for millennia, the silent human had reminded them all what truly mattered. But that night, standing together under the light of twin moons, Marcus and Velara were not thinking about history or politics or the fate of civilizations. They were simply two scarred souls who had found peace in each other's silence, and that was more than enough. The stars continued their ancient dance above Althea Prime, and somewhere in the vast quiet of space, the universe smiled at two small beings who had finally found their way home.